Another big story that's getting too little attention on America's front pages and evening news these days. I mean, the increasing concentration of corporate control over all media. Rupert Murdoch's takeover of the Wall Street Journal got a lot of attention, but most of the press paid little heed to the heart of the matter, what it means to journalism and democracy when fewer and fewer gatekeepers determine the flow of news. An outspoken commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission is here to talk about what can be done about media and democracy. Which brings me to our first story. As Hurricane Dean churned across the Caribbean and then the Gulf of Mexico, I found myself thinking of a tiny radio station in Hancock County, Mississippi. 2 years ago next Wednesday, when Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast, that little station, WQRZ, suddenly became the difference between life and death.
This is WQRZ-Lp.
My colleague Rick Carr reported our story.
It was here, 60 miles east of New Orleans, that the most intense part of Katrina made landfall on August 29, 2005. Winds reached 125 miles per hour, and water from the Gulf surged miles inland.
Our number one goal was to make sure that it doesn't matter what programming you run, we're just waiting for the emergency.
This is 103.5 FM, the voice of Bay St. Louis, Waywin.
Bryce Phillips is chief engineer, general manager, and pretty much everything else for WQRZ, a nonprofit low-power FM community radio station that serves the small towns along the Hancock County coast.
That's what this station is designed to do, was to be 24/7, and we were going to build it to where it was survivable by any natural disaster, especially hurricane.
The water got to the point where it was up above our heads where we're standing right now, right?
Oh yeah, it was halfway up that roof.
Thanks to Bryce Phillips, WQRZ managed to stay on the air throughout Katrina and its aftermath, when most of the commercial radio stations in the path of the storm went silent.
I didn't know that all the rest of those stations were out. I had no clue. I think I'm one of 1,000, but I'm just serving my own community. I had no clue that I was one of 4 out of 41 that survived.
Out of 41
radio stations.
total
On
the Gulf Coast?
Yes, and into New Orleans.
So 90% of the stations went off the air,
That's
but
correct.
You managed to stay on.
At ground zero.
Do you think WQRZ saved lives during the storm? And
I think so, absolutely.
Brian Adam, who just about everybody calls by his nickname Hootie, directs Hancock County's Emergency Operations Center.
Just him putting out our evacuation orders and staying on the air 24 hours with no sleep, him constantly saying, folks, this is going to be bad. The Weather Service is saying it's going to be bad. The National Hurricane Center has said it's going to be bad. Y'all need to please leave.
Small radio stations like WQRZ are important to their communities because they can focus on the specific needs and issues in those communities.
If you look at radio, it's extraordinarily inexpensive compared to other media, compared to television. It's ideally suited for local ownership. It doesn't take a lot of capital. It's almost cheaper than doing a website, in fact. And if you get right down to it, the costs are that low. And it's accessible to anyone that's got a radio, which is basically means it's ubiquitous.
But big media companies have caused hundreds of small local stations to lose touch with their communities. In 1996, broadcasting conglomerates lobbied legislators to remove the limit on the number of radio stations one firm could own. Congress passed the law, and President Bill Clinton signed it.
Almost immediately after that, Clear Channel, Infinity Radio, the biggest media companies in radio that were maxed out then with 40 stations or close to it, went on a buying binge and buying up station after station after station in a 2-year race to gobble up as many stations as humanly possible. And by the end of the sort of deluge, 3 years later, you had a company like Clear Channel with 1,200 radio stations. 1,200 radio stations.
The new mega media chains fired local staff and piped in syndicated shows.
As the ownership has become increasingly concentrated, what we're seeing is that local coverage basically is being stripped out everywhere. Local journalism, local newsrooms, community media basically doesn't make a lot of profits for these firms. Syndicated stuff does. So in community after community, we're seeing there's hardly any coverage of public life.
That wave of mergers alarmed the FCC. In an effort to bring local radio back to communities that had lost it, the commission started licensing hundreds of new local low-power FM radio stations. WQRZ is one of a few hundred nationwide, mostly in small towns and rural areas.
Low Power FM is an extraordinary story in a number of ways. It said basically for a few $100s, you can put out a pretty good signal that'll cover a city or half of a major city and all of a small town at low power. Well, it was despised, obviously, by the commercial broadcasters. The last thing they needed was a lot of new options on the dial that were local people doing stuff locally without ads on the air.
If big media had had its way, none of the news stations would have gone on the air. The National Association of Broadcasters pressured the FCC to abandon the program, arguing that the new stations would cause interference. The commission refused. Its engineering staff said there were no grounds for concern. So the NAB went to Congress, along with National Public Radio, which also worried about interference. They convinced lawmakers to cut the program by 1/2. Bryce Phillips was one of the few to win one of the new licenses. He says WQRZ proves that it doesn't take much money to get a radio station on the air. He lives on Social Security checks he receives for a medical disability. Yet before the storm, he built a transmitter shack and 100-foot tower himself and turned a bedroom of his house into a broadcast studio. The shack and tower weathered the storm. The house didn't.
See, the house basically pulled up from the floor joist and just floated to the right and set back down 2 foot.
Things were just gone, just completely gone. You're listening to WQRZ-Lp.
Sarah Allen is a radio engineering consultant who came to Hancock County as a volunteer about a week after the storm to help upgrade WQRZ's signal so that it could reach more of the devastated county.
The radio station tower did survive, and that was the efforts of Bryce Phillips and the foresight he had in the construction of that tower.
Ain't nothing better in the world. To see that tower up there was just, I was elated. I couldn't even, there was no words. I was just like on cloud 9. I saw my tower, I was like, yeah. I couldn't believe it was still there.
Allen was so impressed with Bryce Phillips' dedication and the station's vital role in the wake of the storm that she decided to stick around. She spent hours on the air reading announcements and spreading news.
As broadcasters, he and I realized that that's our mission. We have to stay on the air. I'm Sarah Allen, and I'm sitting in for Captain Bryce Phillips. He'll be
The FCC allowed WQRZ to crank up its power from 100 watts to nearly 2,000, enough to expand the station's reach to 30 miles. 9 months after the storm, WQRZ was still Hancock County's only broadcaster, and Bryce Phillips was still airing hours of interviews and information every day from a news studio at the County Emergency Operations Center.
To me, the logic behind getting him high-powered status was so the whole county and even some in Harrison County could hear him. And, you know, we're still trying to keep his high-powered status at this time.
This is WQRZ-Lp.
He's probably saved as many people after the storm that he did before the storm because of being able to tell them where to go get food, water, and ice.
How did people in the rest of the county find out that you were on the air?
FEMA bought 3,500 AM/FM radios like that one right up there, and they gave them out where they gave out food, water, and ice.
Here we go.
And that's how they knew where we were, because they gave one to every survivor.
So FEMA was actually telling people, here's some food, here's some water, here's some ice, here's a radio.
Here's a radio.
There are commercial stations in Biloxi and Gulfport, which aren't too far from here. Weren't they doing the job that was necessary here in Hancock County to keep people apprised of what was going on?
Generally speaking, those radio stations were providing emergency information and doing a good job at it. The problem was that they could not focus on Hancock County, and the needs here in Hancock County, given that basically Bay St. Louis, Waveland, Diamond Head was ground zero for the eye of Hurricane Katrina.
How long was it underwater?
Not more than a couple hours, the whole house. And then from the floor level down, it stayed in water for 2 weeks at least. Yeah, this is my home. I cannot replace my house. I don't have the money to do it. I'm on Social Security. I get $500 a month. But there's no way I can rebuild my house, much less the studio. You know, so actually, in a way, that's where I'm in this level of service to my community. Because when you're left with the last resource, you share it with your friends, you share it with your family, and you certainly share it with each other.
What makes you want to give and share when you've lost everything?
That's what you do. I didn't get into public radio not to share. Otherwise, I'd be in commercial radio.
There are about 800 low-power stations in America like QRZ, community-based, non-commercial radio stations aimed specifically at listeners within 3 to 5 miles of the transmitter. Low-power radio emerged 7 years ago and was quickly quashed by the National Association of Broadcasters, the powerful lobbying arm of corporate media.